Hi, my name is Alicia Ray, and I'm going to be walking you through an asynchronous review of the anatomy and physiology of the sympathetic nervous system. Let's go ahead and get started. I want you to review these learning objectives on your own time so that you should use these as a study guide when preparing for your exam. Here's our roadmap for today's material. I'm going to review some important sympathetic nervous system anatomy, and then we'll zoom in, we'll talk about the SNS neuron signaling, and then we will talk about the physiologic responses that are mediated by the sympathetic nervous system, focusing on the fight or flight response. So here we have two diagrams of the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nerves originate in the spinal cord at the level of the thoracic vertebra and either the first two or first three lumbar vertebra. So their cell bodies, the cell bodies for these sympathetic neurons are in the spinal cord, and the axons of these are going to project out of the spinal cord through these holes here that are called the intervertebral foramen. So this image here on the left, these are showing the sympathetic nerves that are originating from the spinal cord. And over here on the right side, you see running vertically along this axis here next to the spinal cord and the vertebra, something called the sympathetic chain ganglion. So sympathetic nerves are the ones that are the horizontal, sort of in blue, these lines here that are coming out from the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramen, and they are going to synapse up and down the sympathetic ganglion chain right here. So sympathetic spinal nerves are called preganglionic because the axons synapse with the cell bodies of sympathetic nerves that are located in the sympathetic chain ganglia. So here we see here this sympathetic nerve, a group of axons, so a fiber here that's emerging through the intervertebral foramen, and this is going to be very short. It's going to immediately synapse with sympathetic ganglia. So here, again, running vertically, you have the sympathetic chain ganglia running all the way from the cervical vertebra all the way down to the sacrum. You can see that better here shown in yellow. So these little bulges or enlargements are called ganglia, and they are the accumulation of neuron cell bodies. And it's these sympathetic spinal nerves that come out of the spinal cord and are synapsing on cell bodies in these ganglia. So the axons of the preganglionic neurons can branch, and they can actually travel up and down the sympathetic chain. So a single preganglionic neuron can synapse with many, many postganglionic neurons up and down the sympathetic chain. And that's one way the effects of stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system are so widespread. So next, we're going to go ahead and take a look at what happens at a synapse. So we have, there are lots of steps that are involved in the process of neuron signaling, and we're going to see lots of drugs acting on the sympathetic nervous system that can act as either an agonist or an antagonist. So let's zoom in and try to understand what's happening here. So neurotransmitters are either synthesized in the cell body and then transported down to the end, the terminal foot, where they can be packaged in secretory vesicles or secretory granules. And then you have the neurotransmitters in here. Those neurotransmitters are then going to fuse, or sorry, the secretory vesicles will fuse with the cell membrane here, usually after an action potential has given the signal for them to be, the neurotransmitters to be released. And so you have then the neurotransmitters leaving the presynaptic neuron by exocytosis here and traveling across the synapse where they can bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. So the action of the neurotransmitter can then be terminated a number of different ways. It can be taken back up in, so reuptake, into the presynaptic neuron. It can be degraded, or it can simply diffuse away from the synaptic cleft. So again, this here is meant to give you a picture or an idea of what's happening at a synapse. So let's say we have this here is an axon from a sympathetic nerve that's coming out of the spinal cord and synapsing with a sympathetic postganglionic neuron that is present in the spinal ganglia. So preganglionic sympathetic nerves tend to be very short. They're going to release acetylcholine onto nicotinic receptors. You'll see that nicotinic receptor abbreviated here with an N. The acetylcholine here is abbreviated with ACH. Most postganglionic sympathetic nerves are going to tend to be long, and release norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors in their target organs. So if you look here, comparing these two figures, let's start over on the left. We have here, this is representing a neuron from a sympathetic preganglionic neuron that's coming out of the spinal cord, and it's synapsing with a sympathetic postganglionic neuron that is present in the spinal ganglia. So the preganglionic neuron, again, is releasing what? It's releasing acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter onto the postganglionic neuron. The axon of the preganglionic neuron is relatively short compared with the axon of the postganglionic neuron. So the postganglionic neuron tends to have a very long axon that goes all the way out to a target organ, and then it's going to release norepinephrine as its neurotransmitter to help mediate that fight or flight response. So if we take this diagram here and translate that in a different way over on the right, we're essentially showing the same thing, but it's going to differentiate between the different target organs and the subtypes of adrenergic receptors. So again, here coming out from the spinal cord, we have the sympathetic preganglionic neurons. So these spinal nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord, they're going to synapse in the sympathetic ganglia, releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine onto a cell body of a postganglionic neuron. Remember, the N is representing it's a nicotinic receptor. So the acetylcholine is synapsing, it's releasing the acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft, and that's going to stimulate the nicotinic receptor in the ganglion on the postsynaptic neurons axon to extend out to the target organ. What happens most of the time for most of the target organs, it's norepinephrine, NE, is the neurotransmitter that is released from the axon onto the target tissues where it's binding to alpha or beta adrenergic receptors. And this is mostly in things like the cardiac and smooth muscle, but you also see this happening in glands as well. So again, most postganglionic sympathetic neurons are releasing norepinephrine, okay, but not all, which you can see here, and the D here for dopamine. But if we focus on for most, what we see most of the time, most postganglionic sympathetic neurons are releasing norepinephrine. Another term for norepinephrine is noradrenaline. So the receptors they bind to are noradrenergic, but that's kind of a mouthful, noradrenergic receptors. So these are often referred to as adrenergic receptors, and you'll notice that my following lectures on Wednesday and Friday, we're going to talk about adrenergic receptor agonists and adrenergic receptor antagonists. And so that's telling you that these are going to be releasing norepinephrine, same thing as noradrenaline, is what's going to be binding to these receptors to stimulate them. All right, let's see. Something else I want to mention is how this diagram is color-coded, where you see cholinergic nerves in blue, you see noradrenergic in red, okay? So note that some sympathetic postganglionic fibers are going to release acetylcholine rather than norepinephrine. I don't need you to focus on this exception up here. I do want to zoom in on what's going on down here. So let's see what we have down here, the adrenal medulla. So let's back up. So adrenal medulla, this is a modified sympathetic ganglion. It's going to receive sympathetic preganglionic fibers, and it's going to release both epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. So remember, the adrenal medulla, part of the adrenal gland, it's sitting on top of the kidneys. So the sympathetic nervous system helps to mediate the fight or flight response, and it does this mainly by mediating the release of norepinephrine onto target tissues. But this sympathetic nervous system stimulation can get amplified by our adrenal glands, thanks to both epinephrine and norepinephrine that's going to be released in the form of hormones into the bloodstream. So these are not being released from a nerve, but they're being secreted into the bloodstream by the adrenal gland to further stimulate that fight or flight response. So next we'll take a look at how that's done. So I already mentioned that the adrenal gland is sitting on top of your kidney, and the adrenal medulla, which is shown in here, is in the interior of the adrenal gland. And it's the adrenal medulla is a specialized neural tissue. These are endocrine cells that are called chromaffin cells. Okay, these are chromaffin cells, and these are responsible for secreting the epinephrine and norepinephrine. So again, these are endocrine cells that are really a type of ganglion cell. They're originally derived from neuronal ganglia, but their job is to synthesize epinephrine and norepinephrine and store them in secretory granules. So when the fight or flight response gets activated, an action potential is going to run down that preganglionic neuron, and it bypasses the synapse with the spinal ganglia, and the axon continues all the way down to these chromaffin cells in the adrenal gland. Then it releases acetylcholine onto these endocrine cells, and these cells then secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the circulation. So the epinephrine and norepinephrine that we've been thinking of, we've been talking about norepinephrine as being a neurotransmitter. Here we see that they're acting like hormones, right? Because they're going to be released into the circulation from the adrenal gland, and that's going to further amplify the flight or fight response by the sympathetic nervous system. So this is how the effects of these hormones spreading via the bloodstream, how we can have such widespread effects during our fight or flight response. So both epinephrine and norepinephrine are catecholamines. So a catechol is where you have an aromatic ring, so think of a benzene ring like this, where you have two hydroxyl groups next door to each other. That's a catechol. And then a catecholamine is where then you also have an amino group, which you can see, these are examples of amino groups here, that are also in the compound. So let's take a look at how both norepinephrine and epinephrine are synthesized. I don't need you to memorize these structures, but you need to be able to know and able to describe each of these steps in this transformation, and to be able to recognize the enzyme names that are important for this process. The enzyme names here are shown in blue. You can recognize them as enzyme names because they end in ASE. All right, so these catecholamines, norepinephrine and epinephrine, are synthesized or made from the amino acid tyrosine. So tyrosine, the first thing that happens, you can see I've circled this in red, you see a hydroxylation on the aromatic ring, and this transforms the tyrosine into DOPA. The enzyme that catalyzes this is appropriately named tyrosine hydroxylase, meaning it's hydroxylating tyrosine. Up next, what happens? Well, we see here this carboxylic acid is removed. So that's a decarboxylation. And this decarboxylation produces dopamine. The enzyme that catalyzes this reaction is called amino acid decarboxylase. And that decarboxylase, the second part here, decarboxylase, is what tells you what the enzyme is doing. Up next, what do we see happening? We see another hydroxylation occurring, this time not on the aromatic ring, but at this benzylic position, the position next door to the aromatic ring, in order to form, this hydroxylation, again, you see a hydroxylase here, and what we're hydroxylating is the dopamine. So dopamine beta hydroxylase. Okay, so now we're at norepinephrine. So all of the steps up until here, up all the way up until norepinephrine, these are all going to be occurring in the postganglionic neurons. The final step, norepinephrine to epinephrine, this is important. This is only occurring in the adrenal medulla. It is not happening in postganglionic neurons. Okay, so in the nerve terminal of the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, there's no epinephrine. You have norepinephrine, but not epinephrine. The epinephrine gets synthesized in the adrenal medulla. So again, that epinephrine that's circulating in your bloodstream, that during the fight or flight response, that's coming from your adrenal gland. So we just looked at at a molecular level, how catecholamine synthesis happens. Now let's zoom out and look at this synthesis as well as the reuptake and where this is happening. So let's go ahead and start off with, we know that catecholamines are synthesized from tyrosine, that amino acid. So let's start over here. The tyrosine is taken up using an amino acid transporter that brings it into the terminal foot of the axon. You saw already that the tyrosine is converted into DOPA by the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase. This happens to be the rate-limiting step in the formation of norepinephrine. And then we have DOPA that is converted into dopamine. Dopamine is then going to be taken up into these secretory granules where the final step of formation of norepinephrine occurs. So there is not lots of norepinephrine floating around just loose in the terminal foot. It's going to be stored in these secretory granules. Then you're going to have some kind of action potential, it's represented here, coming down the length of the axon, and that's going to stimulate the influx of calcium ions. This influx of calcium ions is going to then stimulate the exocytosis of the secretory granules and the release of norepinephrine into the synaptic cleft, where then that norepinephrine here can diffuse across the synapse, and it can bind to receptors, this post-junctional receptors, alpha or beta adrenergic receptors that'll be tissue specific. So depending on the tissue, that will dictate the types of receptors that are there. And then this signal process can then be terminated a couple of different ways. You can have the norepinephrine just diffuse away. It can be metabolized. It can bind to prejunctional receptors. Here we see that alpha-2 prejunctional receptors. And alpha-2 receptors, by the way, are drug targets that help to shut off the signal, since stimulating them will inhibit then the release of norepinephrine. And then the primary way the signaling on the postjunctional receptors gets terminated is through and that's why it's shown here with the thickest arrow, is through the reuptake of the norepinephrine through the norepinephrine transporter, NET is how it's abbreviated here. So the norepinephrine gets taken back up and can be metabolized or recycled back into those secretory vesicles. So again, notice here in this diagram what you don't see. You don't see any epinephrine in the nerve terminal. So epinephrine, remember, that gets synthesized in the adrenal medulla. So this slide is going to summarize the receptors that are mediating the fight or flight response activation. So fight or flight response is mediated by the sympathetic nervous system, and the receptors that mediate the response are going to be tissue specific. It'll be really helpful if you watch this video here, which gives you a nice overview of the fight or flight response. It helps also if you just imagine what happens when your fight or flight response gets stimulated. Like if you wake up in the middle of the night because your smoke alarm is going off, you think about what's going on. So I've put a number of things here, and the ones in red we're going to focus on. So if we think of stimulation of the fight or flight response, one of the first things that happens during the fight or flight response is that your heart rate increases and your blood pressure goes up. And that's because norepinephrine is being released from those sympathetic postganglionic neurons onto beta-1 receptors on the heart. So again, that's what is going to increase your heart rate, and that will increase your blood pressure. So the effects on the heart are mediated by stimulating beta-1 receptors on the heart. And the way I remember beta-1 versus beta-2 is what we see in the lungs. You have one heart and you have two lungs. So beta-1 for the heart, beta-2 for the lungs. So if you're going to be running out of the burning building, your heart rate needs to increase, your blood pressure needs to go up because you need to get blood right up to your skeletal muscles. Your respiration also needs to increase, so you've got norepinephrine from the sympathetic postganglionic nerves that are stimulating then the beta-2 receptors in your lung. So stimulation of beta-2 receptors helps to open up the bronchioles so that you can increase your respiration. So you're getting more air into your lungs in order to oxygenate your blood. If we look down here, in order to get out of the burning building, you also need energy in the form of glucose getting out to your muscles. So norepinephrine is going to be binding to beta-2 receptors on the liver to stimulate the release of glucose via glycogenolysis, breaking down glycogen to glucose. So we've got here the main responses that are mediating the fight or flight the main receptors that are mediating the fight or flight response. Both norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to be released from the adrenal gland in order to amplify these responses, since they're going to be binding to these same receptors and will amplify the responses by the neurons. The other things that you see here related to the alpha-1 and the beta-3 here, these mediated alpha-1 and beta-3 mediated responses where you see things that are getting shut down. And there are certain things that don't need to be happening. If you watch this video here, you can think about do we need to be digesting food? Not so much. So another part of sympathetic nervous system activation is to shut down processes that aren't important in a life-threatening situation. So this figure is going to summarize where different types of adrenergic receptors are primarily expressed and what activation of those receptors looks like in terms of their physiological response. So I want you to read through this You need to be able to create this table from memory so that you can understand the pharmacological effects of drugs that we'll be discussing on Wednesday, adrenergic receptor agonists, and then on Friday we'll talk about adrenergic receptor antagonists. So this is a really, really important slide. I want you to read through it. I want you to be able to create it from memory. So how do you read this table? So if you look at the receptor subtype here for beta 1 receptors, where they're primarily expressed on the heart and kidney, and their physiological response when they are activated. So if you have a beta 1 agonist, for example, activating them, you're going to see an increase in heart rate and contractile force in the heart. For the kidney, increase in renin release, and that is going to increase blood pressure. So that's how you read this table. So what I want you to do, and what we're going to pick up, where we're going to pick up at 2 o'clock on Monday, I want you to think about how sympathetic activation is going to affect blood vessels. And a little hint, this is kind of given away in the video that I referred to on, I think it was slide 10. Think about, is it going to cause them to dilate or constrict? Take a look at that. I also have another video here which deals with sympathetic nervous system activation and blood flow and the specific receptors that are mediating this response. So think about, during the fight or flight response, do you need blood going to the skin, the skeletal muscle, the GI tract? So think about that and come to class at 2 o'clock on Monday prepared to discuss. So where do you think sympathetic nervous system activation is going to constrict blood vessels? Where is it going to dilate? Okay, I'm already trying to give it away. So think about that, and I'll see you in class Monday at 2 o'clock.